Hello my YouTube audience, and especially the younger listeners. I'm Crime Whisper. I know a lot of you enjoy drifting off to sleep while listening to these stories. So before you close your eyes tonight, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable, relax, and let's sink into tonight's case story. 1. Jealousy. It's one of the most dangerous emotions we face. Studies suggest that nearly 40% of murders are driven by it. Jealousy can spring from a partner, a friend, a family member, even a stranger, but what happens when that darkness comes from those you trust most? For 14-year-old Amelia Sjöberg from Sweden, that nightmare became horrifyingly real. What began as a simple pajama party invitation turned into a deadly trap, one set by the very girls she called her friends. The attack was not only brutal, it was filmed and shared online, so what could drive such young minds to such an unthinkable act? By the end of this video, you may find yourself questioning how well you really know the people you let close. Before we get to the events of that night, let's take a moment to truly know Amelia. At just 14, she was a bright, spirited girl from Landskrona. In southern Sweden, she carried a quiet maturity. Shaped by a childhood that wasn't always easy, Amelia had spent time in foster care and dreamed of the same thing every child longs for, a place to feel safe, loved, and truly at home. Her mother, Anna Sjöberg, had become a mom at 19 and fought hard to give Amelia that stability. Anna's own childhood had been marked by hardship, but she was determined to give her daughter better. Amelia didn't let her challenges hold her back. She was energetic, creative, and full of life, especially on TikTok, where she expressed herself with videos filled with kindness and messages of friendship. She reached people far beyond Sweden, sharing her light with the world. Her mother proudly shared her daughter's milestones too. One memory Anna often spoke about was Amelia's 13th birthday, a moment she captured in a joyful video. Another was from when Amelia was just 2 years old. She decided to send her pacifiers to children in Africa. Even at that age, her compassion shone through. Like any teenager, Amelia faced struggles, particularly with friendships. Reports suggest she had a falling out with other teens from a youth home she once stayed in. While the details aren't fully clear, they may have played a role in what came next. Still, Amelia stayed optimistic, finding joy in the little things, and in July 2024, one of those joys was an upcoming pajama party she couldn't wait to attend. On July 21st, 2024, Amelia asked her mother if she could go to the sleepover. Anna agreed, and Amelia set off with her friends, unaware that she would never return. Instead of heading to a party, her so-called friends led her to a deserted industrial area near the Landskrona railway station. They told her it was part of the night's plan. Why wouldn't she believe them? They were her friends, but they weren't. Court documents show that Amelia was likely killed sometime between July 21st and July 22nd. Her body was found just after midnight on Tuesday, July 23. She was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were far too severe despite the desperate efforts of doctors. Amelia died shortly after arriving. Chief Investigator Cam Pearson confirmed her body showed clear signs of extreme violence. Later, it was revealed that Amelia had multiple stab wounds to her neck and had been bound with silver tape. Prosecutor Thomas Alvier stated that she had been deliberately restrained and intentionally killed. In the most chilling part, the killers, both girls, were only 13 and 15 years old. Something so brutal is hard for anyone to process, and at first, many on social media believed Amelia's murder might have been racially motivated, but both the media and police have stayed silent on possible motives, waiting for the investigation to reveal the truth. What investigators couldn't ignore, however, was how quickly recordings of the attack began circulating online. The video itself is almost impossible to watch. The sheer fact that two young girls not only had the time, but also the presence of mind to film such a savage act is beyond comprehension. As horrifying as it is, those same recordings became key to the investigation. From the footage, it was clear the attackers were teenage girls, the very ones who had posed as Amelia's friends. Reports from Swedish media say Amelia had an argument with one of the girls shortly before her death. Not long after, the 13 and 15-year-old fatally attacked her. Even more disturbing, the suspects reportedly bragged about what they had done in a group chat and shared the video of the killing themselves. Those recordings will now serve as crucial evidence in court when the girls were arrested. One of them admitted her role and gave details to police about what led to the attack. Her lawyer confirmed she had spoken openly with investigators, and both girls made certain admissions during questioning as for motive. According to Expressen newspaper, the murder may have stemmed from something as petty as a jealous argument over an insult, possibly involving a boy. Amelia's mother also believes her daughter's life was taken because of jealousy tied to a relationship. One suspect told police she never intended to kill Amelia, claiming the situation spiraled out of control, but evidence uncovered by the media points toward premeditation. The girls had allegedly stolen silver tape and a knife before the attack, suggesting this wasn't spontaneous at all. The 15-year-old, who was arrested first, had been staying in the same youth home where Amelia once lived. She remains in custody. The younger girl, just 13, has been placed under the care of social services in the days after the murder. Local police and the Coast Guard searched the harbor near the industrial site where Amelia was found 2 days later. A bag containing her bank cards and personal items was pulled from the water, though authorities haven't said exactly what they were looking for that same day. Chief Investigator Cam Pearson confirmed police had recovered a knife near the crime scene, believed to be the murder weapon, along with a second knife also taken into evidence. This case is still unfolding, and more details will come to light in the community. Many are calling for the suspects to be tried as adults, arguing the brutality of this crime is beyond what most could imagine, no matter the age. Sadly, Amelia's case isn't an isolated tragedy. In recent years, there's been a disturbing rise in young people committing serious, even lethal, acts of violence, sometimes over something as small and senseless as jealousy. One heartbreaking example is the murder of 13-year-old Tristan Bailey in the United States. Like Amelia, she had her whole life ahead of her. Tristan was a bright, energetic cheerleader with a wide smile and big dreams, all cut short in May 2021 when she was murdered by her 14-year-old classmate. Aiden Fucci, Fucci, and Tristan lived in the same neighborhood and attended the same school. Friends later told investigators that Fucci often talked about killing people, even describing how he'd drag someone into the woods and stab them on the night of her death. Fucci convinced Tristan to meet him outside. Surveillance footage shows them walking together toward the area where her body would later be found. Just over an hour later, Fucci is seen returning alone, his shoes in his hands. The autopsy revealed a level of violence that shocked the nation. Tristan had been stabbed 114 times, 49 of those wounds were defensive, proof of how fiercely she fought for her life while Tristan was still missing. Fucci posted a Snapchat selfie from the back of a police car, holding up a peace sign with the caption, "Hey guys, has anybody seen Tristan lately?" Someone replied, "You were with her, Aiden." When investigators searched the area, they found a buck knife in a nearby pond, its tip broken off. That missing piece was lodged in Tristan's scalp. DNA evidence linked the weapon to Fucci, and police found blood-stained clothes and shoes in his home. Investigators also uncovered a knife sheath and a notebook filled with disturbing, violent sketches. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was how some adults failed to do the right thing instead of helping police. Aiden Fucci's own mother, Crystal Smith, was caught on camera trying to wash a pair of bloody jeans the day after Tristan Bailey's murder in a recorded conversation at the police station. She asked her son if he was sure nothing from that night was still on his clothes. "I don't think so," Fucci replied. "Why?" She whispered. "Blood." That single word sealed it. Crystal Smith was arrested for tampering with evidence, a chilling reminder of how misguided actions can make an already horrific situation even worse. The rise in teen violence, especially Crimes as brutal as these is hard to comprehend. We search for reasons, but beyond individual motives, there's a bigger, more unsettling question. What's happening with young people today? Why are more and more of them so desensitized to extreme violence? In a recent interview, Matt Henson, the attorney for the Bailey family, reflected on the disturbing similarities between Amelia's murder and Tristan Bailey's case. He highlighted a growing global trend, a rise in violent acts committed by young people. Henson noted that young perpetrators often lack the sophistication to cover up their crimes, which is why many are caught quickly. Their developing brains make it harder to plan complex offenses or think ahead about consequences they don't quite comprehend. He said that there's a punishment behind this. A lot of times, they think they're going to get away with it. This lack of foresight often leads to sloppy crime scenes in Amelia's case. For example, investigators recovered a knife near the spot where she was killed and found her belongings dumped in the harbor. A poorly executed attempt to destroy adults become involved, either by assisting directly or covering up after the fact, just like Fuchi's mother in Amelia's case. Police have questioned at least one adult, though their exact role remains unclear. Henson also drew a parallel to a case that shocked the world a decade ago, the infamous Slender Man stabbing in May 2014. Two 12-year-old girls, Anissa Weyer and Morgan Geyser, lured their friend, Peyton Leutner, into the woods after a sleepover. Geyser then stabbed Peyton 19 times with a kitchen knife. The two left her for dead, believing that killing her would protect their families from Slender Man, a fictional horror character from the internet. Miraculously, Peyton survived by crawling out of the woods and finding help. The case became the subject of HBO's 2017 documentary Beware the Slender Man. Both attackers later took plea deals and were sent to mental health institutions rather than prison cases. Like this might help explain why some teens are so careless about committing serious crimes. They may believe they'll receive shorter sentences, perhaps 20 to 30 years, or be sent to a hospital instead of serving life in prison for them. The consequences might not seem as permanent or as frightening as they truly are, and with their still developing brains, they may not fully grasp the enormity of what they've done. Turning back to Amelia's case, the weight of her loss is almost too much to put into words. Her mother, Anna Schoberg, just 33 years old, has been left in unbearable grief. Speaking to local media, she said, "I can't believe she's gone. Every time the phone rings, I still check to see if it's her calling. I'm in complete denial at the time." The case was still unfolding, with Amelia's family waiting for confirmation through DNA and dental records, holding on to a sliver of hope that somehow it wasn't true to officially confirm Amelia's identity. Police had to wait for DNA and dental records, even though they already knew it was her. Anna will never forget the moment officers arrived with the priest to deliver the news. "I told them they couldn't tell me anything more," she recalled. "I've already lost my parents." She was still in disbelief, struggling to understand how anyone could hurt her daughter. To Anna, Amelia was an angel, the kind of girl who stood up for others, even at her own expense. Maybe, Anna thought, the world just wasn't ready for someone that kind. In the days before her death, Amelia had been anxious about the pajama party. She and her mom had a small disagreement, but Amelia quickly sent a text. "Sorry, Mom, for being difficult because I was stressed. I love you. You're my life." It was one of the last messages Anna would ever receive from her. The loss was made even more heartbreaking by the fact that mother and daughter had only recently reconnected. Amelia had been in foster care since the age of 5, and they were finally rebuilding their lives together, even making plans for a new home. Anna had just finished building Amelia a dressing table, and they had been picking out new furniture for her room. She was so excited. Anna said through tears the pajama party was meant to be Amelia's first real social event. Her story is a sobering reminder. Sometimes it's better to walk alone than to surround yourself with people who secretly want to see you fail. Real friends lift you up, not tear you down. Story 2. In the music capital of Nashville, A young couple who seemed to have everything ahead of them met a sudden and brutal end, the shocking circumstances of their deaths, paired with the hidden double life of one of the victims, would lead investigators down a twisting path involving a wealthy businessman and former military operatives. Why would a millionaire order their deaths? And how did he convince trained ex-Marines to carry it out? William Lanway was 36. Holly Williams was 33 at first glance. Holly seemed like the picture of stability. She grew up in a loving home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, with family who described her as sweet, trusting, and eager to help others. Her striking beauty, often compared to a Kardashian, was matched by an equally warm personality. When she decided to pursue a career as a medical success seemed inevitable in ways past, was much darker. Trauma had followed him from childhood, most of it inflicted by the man who should have been his protector when he was just a boy. His father aimed a gun at his head and threatened to kill him a week later. That same man stabbed Lanway's mother to death before going to prison, leaving William effectively orphans. Somehow Lanway managed to move forward. He married, became a father, and found joy in his young daughter, until tragedy struck again. She died from brain cancer at just 5 years old. That loss left him hollow, and in his early 30s, he spiraled into heavy drinking and emotional instability. It was during this low point that he met Holly. The two clicked instantly, but theirs was a stormy relationship, full of arguments and reconciliations. Holly's friends would later reveal that she had taken a dangerous detour in her life, working as an escort under the name Leela Love to supplement her income. That secret would become the spark for the violence to come. Police records show that Holly had called 911 on Lanway at least 3 times in the year before their deaths. His temper, perhaps inherited from his father, could be explosive. Concerned for her safety, Holly even installed security cameras around her home. Still, the couple shared an interest in making money, and their speculation Lanway may have known, or eventually discovered, about Holly's escort work, whether he approved or sought to profit from it. The truth is unclear. What is clear is that on February 3, 2020, Holly received a text from someone who would change everything. Austin Bate, millionaire Eric Montmont, came from generational wealth. His grandfather, Charles Mond, had founded the highly successful Mond Automotive Group in 1957. Eric took over the family empire and expanded it further, enjoying all the privileges of a booming business. In 2020, Mond was living the high life, a $5 million, 10-bedroom mansion in Austin, with the prestigious Austin Country Club golf course as his backyard. But beneath the polished exterior, he harbored an insatiable sexual appetite that his wife could never seem to fulfill. That February, while visiting his son at college in Nashville, Mond stumbled upon an online ad for an escort named Leela Love. Struck by her supermodel-like beauty, he couldn't resist. On February 3rd, using the alias Eric Moore to cover his tracks, he arranged a hotel meeting with her, neither of them realizing this encounter would ignite a chain of events ending in bloodshed. By March 1st, Mond received a chilling text from an unknown number. The sender claimed to know about his night with Leela Love and threatened to expose the affair to his wife unless he paid $25,000. The blackmailer, William Lanway, the boyfriend of Leela, whose real name was Williams, after he'd discovered Mond's number while snooping through her phone net. Still unclear whether Williams was involved in the extortion plot, but regardless, Mond refused to pay. He knew that giving in to blackmail would only open the door to further demands. Instead, he decided to deal with the problem another way, one that would soon turn deadly. As a wealthy auto dealership owner, Mond had connections in private security. One such contact was Gilad Peld, an Israeli national and former member of the Israel Defense Forces. Peld, owner of Spirup Security Group, had worked with celebrities like Charlie Sheen and handled high-end security for luxury jewelers. Mond had hired him before for routine tasks, like clearing homeless people from his dealership's lot. But this time, the job was far darker. On March 5th, Mond paid Peld $15,000 to investigate the threatening message and identify the sender. Peld brought in two ex-Marines, Brian Brockway and Adam Carey, who had transitioned into private security after Special Operations Service. Brockway's brother, Chad, also a security firm owner, helped draft an intelligence report known as a SITREP situation report, which would guide their next moves. The team set up a secure pinger account to communicate and began tracking Landway and Williams. Neither had any idea they were now being hunted by men with military training. On March 10th, Williams' outdoor security cameras recorded a large, bearded man knocking at her door inside. Visibly anxious, she paced the living room, gripping a rod to block the door. The man insisted he just wanted to ask her a few questions, but she stayed silent, too terrified to respond. Had she opened that door, the events that followed might have played out very differently, but we'll never know. It seems Landway quickly learned about the visit, because the next day, March 11th, he called Mond at home. His intention was to frighten Mond into paying up instead. The call sent Mond into a panic. The thought of Landway reaching his wife or showing up at his home was unbearable. If Landway had his home phone number, did that mean he knew his address too? For Mond, merely identifying the blackmailer wasn't enough. He wanted both Landway and Williams gone permanently. Brockway made a chilling proposal. He could take care of them both for $60,000 each. Mond didn't hesitate. He agreed, sealing their fate at 11:40 p.m. on March 12th. Security cameras recorded Williams and Landway leaving their home. It would be the last time they were seen alive. Moments later, the audio captured Williams screaming in sheer terror, blood-curdling cries that told of a brutal, frenzied attack. Police photos later confirmed what those screams had foreshadowed. She had been savagely beaten, her final moments filled with unimaginable horror. Several bruises from the initial assault were already forming on Williams' body. The attackers, later identified as Carey Brockway and a third, still unknown gunman, didn't waste any time before ending Landway's life while Williams was being beaten. Landway's body was riddled with bullets. The barrage was so relentless that he died instantly. Williams, helpless against three much larger assailants, could only watch in horror as her boyfriend was executed in front of her. Her desperate screams grew into spine-chilling shrieks, echoing into the night as she lay defenseless on the ground. At one point, one of the assailants even repositioned the home's security camera, angling it toward the floor so it would capture nothing of what came next for the next hour and a half. The events remain a mystery. What is certain is that Williams was eventually forced into the trunk of a white Honda Acura alongside her boyfriend's lifeless body. The assailants then drove to a nearby construction site. There, in the isolation of unfinished buildings and silent dirt lots, they ended Williams' life as well, shooting her without mercy. It's likely the empty site reverberated with her final screams, though no one was close enough to hear them from the surviving security footage. Williams appears to be begging her attackers to stop. Perhaps she pleaded until her last breath, but they showed her no humanity. When the murders were over, the killers still had a major problem. They had no clear plan to dispose of the bodies. They could have dumped them anywhere, but instead opted for something dramatic and destructive, leaving both victims inside the vehicle. They sent the Acura hurtling into a tree at high speed. A nearby construction worker heard the impact and rushed toward the wreckage. What he found was horrifying. Two bullet-riddled bodies slumped inside. He immediately called 911. By the time police arrived and cordoned off the area, the killers had vanished. The investigation dragged on for over a year before any solid leads emerged. In the meantime, the conspirators were busy covering their tracks. Soon after the murders, the attackers deleted the pinger account they had been using to communicate, erasing a vital digital trailer at Mond. The man accused of orchestrating the killings believed his plan had succeeded. Satisfied with the outcome, he transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars to Peld's company account as payment. Mond assumed life would return to normal. He was wrong. Brockway had brought in the third unidentified gunman, to assist with the hit-to decision that would unravel the conspiracy. Details remain murky. But somehow, this gunman discovered that Mond was the client behind the killings. Instead of walking away, he saw an opportunity for more money. The man who had been willing to take lives for cash now turned to extortion, demanding $25,000 in hush money. This led to a recorded phone conversation between Peld and Monta, conversation that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Recorded call, transcript. Peld: "Yeah, can you hear me? I can't hear you with all the cars, okay? You ready?" Mond: "Yeah." Peld: "You by yourself?" Mond: "Yeah." Peld: "Okay, we've got a problem. One of the shooters in Nashville, I don't know how, but he found out you were the client who paid for the job. He's hurting for money, and now he wants to get paid. About $25,000. Mond: "But if I give him 25, when's he gonna stop?" Peld: "I know. But he's not like the other guy you dealt with before, the one who was threatening your family. This guy's just a soldier who needs money. He's not threatening your family, Mond. If you're sure he won't come back, I'll get the money together. I don't care about the 25 grand. I just don't want this coming up again in a few months." Peld: "I'll talk to Brian. See if he can reason with him. Worst case, you pay the 25. Best case, it goes away." Mond: "If it doesn't go away, honestly, I'd rather take care of it permanently." Peld: "Got it. I'll have Brian try to handle it. If it turns into a problem, we'll do it like last time. Run it through Speartip." This exchange made it chillingly clear. Mond was willing to pay for silence, but also to order another killing if it meant protecting himself. What neither man realized at the time was that these words would later be played in court, unmasking the depth of the conspiracy and the cold-blooded nature of the crimes. It would take him some time to gather $100,000 in cash, money he could probably get, but not immediately. "Got it?" came the reply. "Let me talk to Brian and see what we can do. All right, I'm traveling back from South Texas. If you need to call me, I'll have to pull over like I just did. That's why you hear all those cars." "Got it. I'll check it." "So, you're heading back home?" "Yeah, back in Austin in a couple hours." "Okay, thanks." Once again, the choice was made to pay more for a permanent solution rather than a smaller sum to end things peacefully. But Brockway never got the chance to deal with the third gunman. By then, authorities were closing in because the case involved suspects in multiple states. The FBI stepped in during June 2020. Initially, they had no leads on the men in the surveillance footage, so they turned to the victims' phone records. That's when they discovered both victims had received calls from a voice-over IP number. This masked the caller's identity, but it also left a digital trail following it, led investigators straight to Adam Carey. When they compared Carey's driver's license photo to the security footage, it was an obvious match. Another major break came in early 2021, when investigators recovered a Tennessee rep, a situational report containing all the details of the murder-for-hire plot. While it's unclear how they obtained it, the document outlined surveillance plans and the use of a security company to execute the hit over the next few months. Investigators pieced everything together. They uncovered $750,000 in transactions from Mond to Peel's company. They found messages showing Mond lured one of the victims, Williams, to meet him at a bar on February 5th, and then came the most damning piece of evidence, a recorded phone call in which Peel and Mond discussed paying off the gunman or taking him out by December 2021. All four conspirators were in custody. Carey was arrested in North Carolina. Brockway was caught in San Diego. Peel was intercepted at Austin's airport before boarding a flight. Mond, the mastermind, was picked up during a routine traffic stop when agents brought Mond in for questioning. He appeared unfazed. "Even with handcuffs on, we don't like interviewing people in cuffs. You good with us?" An agent asked. "Yes, sir." The agents explained they would read him his rights, then share evidence before asking questions. Mond calmly initialed each line, acknowledging he understood. First of all, an agent said, "Do you have any idea why we're here?" "I have no idea. Would it help if we told you we're from Nashville, Tennessee?" My son goes to school there, Mont replied casually. The lead investigator leaned in. Why don't you hear what we've got? I think you have a story to tell, and I think it's complicated. I see things in shades of gray, not just black and white. Not everybody who's involved in something like this is the same. The investigators made it clear from the start. This wasn't about branding anyone as purely evil. They understood that life can spiral in ways no one plans for. Sometimes you make choices under pressure, and those choices lead to worse and worse outcomes until you find yourself backed into a corner with nowhere left to go. That's why they were there. They wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but also a reality check. The more truthful he could be, they told him, the better his credibility. Truthfulness could show remorse, which might help him in the long run. Lying, on the other hand, would only destroy that credibility, and, worse, lying to a federal agent was itself a crime right now. One of the investigators said, "The only way you can help yourself is by being honest. Admit what you did. Acknowledge it was a mistake, and make it clear you would never do it again." Then came the moment they stopped talking and started showing him exactly what they were dealing with. They explained that this was a homicide investigation, one tied to an incident in Nashville. He knew the case. They were certain of that. The table lay photographs and audio evidence. They warned him that what he was about to hear was the reality of murder. It was the sound of someone he had once cared about. Holly being shot, over and over, outside her apartment. They didn't spare him the brutality of it. She had suffered for a long time before death came her face, bruised and battered, told the story of the longest hour and a half of her life. Metro Nashville police had tried to untangle the case, but when they hit a wall, federal investigators stepped in. It didn't take long for them to identify everyone involved. The questions began. Did he know Holly? Yes, he met her at a bar in Nashville. Their relationship spanned only 2 encounters. Was he using her services as a prostitute? He admitted that he was. Then came the name Landway. The investigators knew this was a critical figure in the case, but he denied ever meeting him. Still, they told him, Landway had learned that he'd slept with Holly without a condom, and from that point forward, he began trying to extort him. He pushed back. That never happened, he said, but the agents pressed on. They knew about the text messages. They knew about the money. They knew this wasn't something he could talk his way out of, because the case against him was airtight. They had phone records, messages, wire transfers, enough to put every conspirator behind bars. Even then, they gave him a chance to help himself. He didn't take it. His arrogance wouldn't allow it. 4 were ultimately charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping resulting in death, and carrying, brandishing, and discharging a firearm during and in relation to a crime of violence. One co-defendant, Pell, immediately flipped, agreeing to testify against the others in hopes of lessening his own punishment, but his role in the killings was undeniable, and no amount of cooperation could erase that. The trial began on November 3, 2023, with 16 jurors seated to hear over 2 weeks of testimony. Defense teams scrambled to shift blame, each trying to paint their client as a pawn in someone else's scheme. Mont's attorney claimed his client was simply a victim, insisting Pell was the mastermind who intended to squeeze him for money, and that Mont had no idea Williams would be kidnapped and murdered. Brockway's lawyer focused on undermining Pell's credibility, suggesting it was Carey who first proposed killing both Williams and Landway. The jury saw through the tangled web of accusations on November 17. After 7 hours of deliberation, they found all defendants guilty of the murder. Plot sentencing is set for December 2024, when each of them will finally hear exactly how many years, or decades, they will spend paying for Holly's death before that terrible night in 1993. Richard Allen Davis was already a career criminal, born on June 2, 1945. The third of 5 children, his early life was steeped in abuse and instability. When Davis was just 3 years old, he and his brothers were caught playing with matches. Their mother's idea of discipline was to hold each boy's hand against a hot stove, believing the pain would keep them from playing with fire again. Instead, It left deep psychological scars, fueling the sadistic tendencies that would emerge later in his life. His father was no better described as cold, unstable, and prone to hallucinations. On one occasion, he took a gun outside to shoot at imaginary targets on others. He beat Richard so badly that he broke his jaw once and, on another occasion, shoved him straight through an interior wall. The home was filled with violent fights between his parents until their divorce when Davis was 11, but freedom from that chaos didn't bring stability. It marked the beginning of Davis's own descent into crime by 12. He was breaking into buildings by 15. He was in trouble again for burglary at 17, after being caught stealing a motorcycle. The judge gave him a choice: enlist in the Army or serve time with the California Youth Authority. Davis chose the Army, but his stint lasted only 13 months. Before he was discharged in 1973, a deeply suspicious death brought his name to police attention. He attended a party at the home of 18-year-old Marlene Voris that same night. She was found dead from a gunshot wound, with 7 apparent suicide notes scattered nearby. Police ruled it a suicide, but Marlene's friends were certain Davis had killed her. While he avoided charges in that case, he didn't stay out of trouble for long. Soon after, he was imprisoned for the kidnapping of a woman around midnight, just 20 miles north of Polly's home. In the quiet town of Santa Rosa, babysitter named Frances Mays was jolted by a sudden intrusion. A man appeared, brandishing a knife, and ordered her into his car. She had no choice but to comply. He drove her deep into a remote, isolated area where the night seemed to swallow all sound, but then by sheer courage and quick thinking, Frances managed to seize the knife from him. In a burst of desperation, she threw open the door and ran into the darkness, escaping before he could stop her. That man was Richard Allen Davis. Davis was no stranger to the law. Over the years, he had drifted in and out of prison like it was a revolving door, breaking into homes, stealing anything he could get his hands on, and getting caught, only to be released again after serving short stints. It was a vicious cycle, and every time he got out, he went right back to crime. In interviews with a prison psychiatrist, Davis openly admitted that stealing gave him a kind of twisted relief. It eased the tensions building inside. He said his mental health evaluations painted a grim picture: avoidant personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and schizoid personality disorder. He was labeled dangerous, unpredictable, and incapable of controlling his impulses. Still, the system kept releasing him. By 1982, he was out again and almost immediately returned to robbing and harming people. That's when he crossed paths with Sue Edwards, a woman who would become his partner in both romance and crime. In 1984, Davis and Sue targeted a woman named Selena Varick in Redwood City, California. Woman Sue knew through her sister they believed Selena had money, and they wanted it when she refused their demand for $6,000. Davis struck her in the head with a gun, splitting her skin wide open. Blood poured from the wound, and the injury would later require 5 stitches as she bled. They forced her to wash her hair, then marched her to the bank to withdraw the cash. Selena later described Davis's eyes as evil, demonic, saying he seemed to relish her pain. Bank staff, shockingly, did not question the transaction, and Sue left with the money to meet up with Davis. The pair fled, seemingly satisfied, but fate intervened when a police officer pulled Davis over for a broken tail light. A quick records check revealed warrants for the attack on Selena. Both Davis and Sue were arrested. Davis got 8 years, Sue lacking a prior record served. Only 6 months. Fast forward to July 1993. Davis walked out of prison once more. 3 months later, he was in Petaluma, prowling for his next opportunity. That night, 12-year-old Polly Klaus and 2 friends were in Polly's bedroom, enjoying an ordinary sleepover, unaware that Davis was lurking just outside. His exact motive remains unclear. Perhaps he intended only to steal, but when he realized 3 young girls were inside, something darker took over. He entered through an unlocked window, hearing the girls' laughter. He stopped in the kitchen and armed himself with a large knife and, ominous sign that what followed was not a premeditated burglary, but an opportunistic abduction. Opening the bedroom door, Davis startled the girls. "Don't scream, or I'll cut your throats," he warned, claiming he only wanted money. He refused the $50 Polly offered. He ordered the girls to lie on the floor, bound them with white rope, and placed pillowcases over 2 of their heads. Polly, her voice trembling, begged him, "Please don't hurt my mom and sister." He told her friends he'd bring her back after taking valuables from the house, then instructed them to count to 1,000. Minutes later, when the house fell silent, the terrified girls wriggled free and ran to wake Polly's mother, Eve, half asleep. Eve thought they were playing a prank until the horror sank in *30 minutes. After Davis entered the home, Eve was on the phone with 911. "Apparently, a man just broke into our house and took my daughter." Her voice was raw with disbelief and pleading. "If you're the man who has Polly, please." Police immediately broadcast an alert across Sonoma County, but there was a fatal flaw. The alert went out only on Channel 1, a sheriff's frequency, not on the Channel 3 frequency used by most patrol officers. It meant many of the officers who could have been in the right place at the right time never got the message, and this would prove devastating because roughly 90 minutes later on midnight, Richard Allen Davis was already 20 miles away in Santa Rosa, the same town where Francis Mays had once escaped. His knife officers immediately recognized that the ropes found at the scene were strikingly similar to the ones used to restrain Polly's friends on the night of the abduction. Polly's family confirmed that the clothing discovered alongside the ropes belonged to her back in Polly's bedroom. Investigators uncovered a clear handprint on the bedpost, one that didn't match anyone in her family or circle of friends. Detectives quickly suspected it could belong to Richard Allen Davis. They reached out to multiple police departments, searching for a record of his prints. Fortunately, one department did have Davis's handprint on file. This crucial match gave investigators the break they'd been waiting for. 2 days later, police arrested Davis. During questioning, they told him about the fingerprint match. When they asked if he had taken Polly, he gave a slight nod. When they asked if she was still alive, Davis silently shook his head. Davis eventually agreed to show police where he had left Polly. He led them deep into a wooded area near Highway 101, where her body had been hidden beneath a piece of scrap wood in a shallow grave. Detectives later pieced together that on the night his car became stuck, Davis had likely hidden Polly's body in nearby bushes. Officers who had encountered him that night recalled that he was sweating heavily, despite mild weather, and that his clothes and hair were littered with small twigs and dirt. After police helped him free his car, Davis must have returned to retrieve Polly's body, moving her to the final burial site in the woods. The case didn't just end with Davis's arrest. It sparked major changes in policing and criminal justice across the United States. In 1994, California passed the 3 strikes law, aimed at keeping habitual violent offenders like Davis off the streets for good. Under this law, anyone convicted of 3 serious felonies would face a mandatory, lengthy prison sentence. Perhaps even more significant was the change in how law enforcement shared information before Polly's case. Not all police officers received urgent alerts in time. The California Highway Patrol overhauled its communication system so that every urgent crime bulletin now reaches all police channels instantly. When Davis went to trial, the proceedings were swift. His extensive criminal history, the overwhelming evidence against him, and his own admissions left little room for doubt. But Davis also used the trial to inflict more pain, making a cruel and unfounded statement that Polly had allegedly told him, "Just don't do me like my dad," before he killed her. This vicious lie provoked Polly's father, who nearly lunged at Davis in the courtroom before being restrained. The judge, deeply disturbed by both the crime and Davis's courtroom behavior, sentenced him to death. "Mr. Davis, this is always a traumatic and emotional decision for a judge," he said. "You made it very easy today by your conduct today." Richard Allen Davis is 70 years old, sitting on death row in San Quentin State Prison Polly's legacy lives on through two organizations, the Polly Klaus Foundation and the Klaus Kids Foundation, both dedicated to child safety, abduction prevention, and pushing for stronger punishments for those who harm children's story. Four pastors are often seen as figures of compassion, spiritual guidance, and moral integrity. But what happens when the man trusted to lead a congregation turns out to be hiding a much darker truth? More than a decade ago, Randy Stone, loving husband, devoted father, and respected church member, was found shot to death in his office. His desk was still neatly arranged, with notes for upcoming church activities and financial records. A testament to his dedication to his community. Police quickly confirmed it was a homicide. The town gathered in mourning. No one could have imagined that the killer was someone far closer than they realized, but soon, whispers began to surface, rumors that pointed to a truth more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. To understand what happened, we first need to step back into the life of Randy Stone and his wife, Teresa. Randy and Teresa had known each other since childhood, though life had taken them on separate paths that changed when Randy enlisted in the Marines at age 18 after serving his country. He returned to Kansas City, Missouri, in the spring of 1990, with one person firmly on his mind, Teresa. The two quickly reconnected by March of that year. They were inseparable, and by October, they were married a year later. Their son Michael was born, followed by their daughter Miranda. 2 years after that, life in Independence, Missouri, seemed idyllic for the Stones. Randy owned a small insurance company and also served as the minister of records at New Hope Baptist Church, managing church finances and ensuring smooth operations. Teresa, blessed with a beautiful singing voice, performed in the choir and volunteered for church events. Through these activities, the Stones developed a close friendship with the church's new pastor, David Love, who had recently arrived with his wife, Kim, and their 3 children. Love was only 38 at the time, and the family's shared commitment to the church fostered a warm and trusting relationship from the outside. Everything appeared perfect, but behind the scenes, the bonds between these friends would take a dangerous turn, one that would ultimately lead to betrayal, murder, and a community left reeling. Everyone in the Stone family supported one another. After nearly 14 years of marriage, Teresa had devoted herself fully to being a loving stay-at-home mom, always involved in her children's lives. She also helped Randy at his insurance office, playing an active role in the family business. Randy himself was well liked in town, friendly, dependable, and respected. Together, the Stones were cherished members of their community, admired for their kindness, generosity, and the close-knit love they radiated as a family. That love seemed to grow even stronger in 2004, when Teresa made an unexpected announcement. The family would soon be welcoming another child. Michael and Miranda were already approaching their teenage years, so the news of a baby on the way came as a surprise to everyone. But there was a detail that caused quiet controversy. Years earlier, Randy had undergone a vasectomy. He believed they wouldn't be having more children despite his private doubts. Randy chose to stand by his wife. He remained loyal, accepting Teresa's news as truth and trusting that the child was his. But their joy was short-lived. Tragically, Teresa suffered a miscarriage in the aftermath. She struggled deeply, both emotionally and spiritually. Seeking comfort, she turned to her church, specifically to Pastor David Love, the man who had been the family's spiritual leader for years. She began attending counseling sessions with him 2 to 3 times a week. Without fail, Teresa's meetings with Pastor Love became more frequent. She began to pull away from Randy. She was more distant at home, emotionally withdrawn. Randy, seeing her grief, tried to be patient. He assumed she was still mourning the loss of their child. In fact, he also sought guidance from Pastor Love, meeting with him every morning to discuss everything from everyday challenges to moments of joy. Randy respected him immensely. In one self-help book, Randy had even written that David Love was one of the most influential people in his life, a trusted advisor, a mentor, and a close friend. But in early 2010, Randy's view of the pastor began to change as part of his role as minister of records and a member of the church's finance committee. Randy regularly reviewed church accounts. During one of these reviews, he noticed something troubling. Certain funds appeared to be missing. Even more concerning, some of the checks for those missing amounts bore Pastor Love's signature. The discovery rattled Randy to his core. If the evidence was correct, then the man he admired most had been stealing from the very church he led. In March 17, 2010, Randy decided to confront the issue directly. He sent Pastor Love an email outlining his concerns and making it clear that he disagreed with how church finances were being handled. The pastor's response was dismissive. He refused to admit to any wrongdoing. For Randy, the exchange marked a breaking point. Feeling betrayed, he made the difficult decision to resign from his position at the church. He didn't take the matter further legally, but he did inform Pastor Love that his family would also be leaving the congregations 2 weeks later. On March 31, 2010, tragedy struck that morning. Teresa arrived at the insurance office, expecting a normal workday. Instead, she walked into a nightmare. Randy was lying on the floor behind his desk, unresponsive and surrounded by blood. In a panic, she called 911, her voice shaking as she told the operator there was blood coming from Randy's ear, suggesting maybe he had fallen. Maybe it was some kind of accident. But when police arrived, the scene told a different story. Randy Stone had been shot point blank with a .40 caliber pistol. The wound was instantly fatal. The spent casing lay nearby. Investigators quickly confirmed that the gun used was Randy's own, normally kept locked away and accessible only to him. There were no signs of a struggle. Cash still sat untouched on his desk. This wasn't a robbery, it was a targeted killing. Then came another disturbing find in a trash bin next to Teresa's desk. Detectives found torn pieces of paper. They pieced them together into what appeared to be a love letter. It began, "Happy birthday, love," and went on to speak of not being in control yet, but promising that when they were finally together, her birthdays would always be special. The letter was unsigned, but it clearly came from someone familiar with Teresa. Handwriting analysis confirmed that Randy was not the author. The handwriting didn't match his at all on a notepad on his desk. His own notes and reminders looked entirely different. The question now was unavoidable. Who was Teresa's secret admirer? And could that person be connected to Randy's death? Detectives suspected the killer was someone close to Randy, someone who had personal motives rather than random malice. They decided to take a calculated risk at Randy's funeral. Officers attended undercover, wearing hidden recording devices. Their thinking was simple. The killer might be among the mourners. Grief loosens tongues, and sometimes people reveal more than they should in quiet conversations. It proved to be a good decision. Pastor David Love stood before the crowd to deliver Randy's eulogy. His voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "We sit here today and weep," he said, "not just because we are separated from our loved one, but because of all the questions that death brings. Questions like why? Why him? Why now?" Without answers, death feels so cold. As his words filled the sanctuary, detectives listened closely, not only to him, but to the hushed exchanges between guests. The answers they were looking for might already be in that room. Investigators confronted Teresa with the phone records and the torn love letter found in the trash. At first, she tried to downplay their significance, brushing off the messages as harmless and claiming she barely remembered the note. But the mounting evidence told a different story, one of secrecy, calculated deception, and a relationship with Pastor Love that went far beyond simple friendship. The walls were closing in, and detectives could sense she was running out of room to maneuver around Randy's casket. Surrounded by flowers, his family spoke of the future they thought they would share, growing old together, creating memories that would span decades. Now, that vision was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of loss, as the Stone family and the New Hope Baptist Church community grieved. Police were already working tirelessly to find Randy's killer. Their investigation began with the person closest to him, his wife, Teresa Stone. From the outset, Teresa's behavior stood out, rather than displaying the raw grief detectives expected. She appeared oddly composed at times. Even cheerful during questioning. Her demeanor wasn't the only thing that caught their attention. Teresa provided investigators with what she described as a rock-solid alibi for the time of Randy's death, recalling her every move down to the exact minute, complete with receipts. But this level of detail was suspicious in itself. People in shock rarely remember such specifics, especially before discovering a loved one's body. To detectives, her memory felt less like grief and more like rehearsal when questioned about a mysterious love letter found torn up in the trash. Teresa appeared momentarily flustered. "Oath, that birthday note. I forgot all about it until yesterday," she said, explaining that it had been left on her car by someone she didn't know, and insisting she'd never received another. She claimed she had nothing to hide. Detectives pushed further, asking if there had been any recent trouble in her marriage. Teresa admitted to a brief struggle when Randy had faced issues with pornography, but said they had worked through it. She painted their nearly 20-year marriage as loving, happy, and strong. At that point, there was no direct evidence tying her to the murder, only her strange composure and a growing list of unanswered questions. Then, a chilling account from one of Randy's friends, Robert Davis, deepened suspicions. Davis revealed that on the very night of her husband's death, Teresa had come to see him. He expected to console a grieving widow, but instead, Teresa seemed completely unfazed. Her focus wasn't on the loss, but on something else entirely: how to collect on Randy's life insurance policy. This was less than 24 hours after his murder. Detectives soon learned Randy had 2 life insurance policies, totaling $800,000. The twist: shortly before his death, Randy, who worked in the insurance business, had quietly changed the beneficiary from Teresa to their children, as far as anyone knew. Teresa had no idea about this change while investigators worked the financial angle. Rumors began to swirl inside New Hope Baptist Church. Rumors that Teresa had been having an affair with none other than Pastor David Lovett. Wasn't idle gossip. It was, as some called it, the church's worst-kept secret. Love was a close friend of the Stone family and had arrived quickly at the crime scene. Naturally, police questioned him, but when the conversation turned pointed, the pastor asked for an attorney, abruptly ending the interview. Detectives weren't done with him. A search of his computer uncovered damning evidence: intimate emails, romantic photographs, and detailed plans for a future, together with Teresa disguised as arrangements for her daughter's upcoming wedding. There was even talk of engagement rings. One exchange stood out in particular. The couple compared themselves to the biblical story of King David, who had arranged for the death of Bathsheba's husband so he could marry her. Pastor Love wrote that God had still blessed that union. Teresa replied with words that investigators would later read with chilling weight. By the time Teresa sat down for a second round of questioning, detectives had in hand a decade's worth of correspondence between her and Pastor Love. Both admitted to a long-standing affair, but that only sharpened the question: was this love story connected to Randy's murder? Phone records soon offered more answers. Investigators discovered that Teresa and Love had used prepaid cell phones to hide their communications, though occasional slip-ups exposed calls to their regular lines. The most damning detail came from the morning of the murder. Love's phone had pinged off a cell tower just miles from Randy's insurance office, and then there was a text Teresa received that same morning: urgent, do not go to the office by yourself. Despite the warning, she went anyway, and found her husband's lifeless body, now armed with phone data and the torn love letter. Investigators confronted Teresa at first. She tried to brush it all off, but detectives could feel the facade cracking. The story she'd so carefully constructed was about to come apart. Teresa clung to her story, insisting the prepaid phones were nothing more than a way to keep her counseling sessions with David a secret. She claimed his wife, Kim, had always been uneasy about the attention David gave her over the years, but by now, detectives had far too much evidence to accept Teresa's flimsy explanations. They pressed harder, laying out the facts that pointed to a calculated, premeditated Killing Teresa denied it all, insisting the phones, the messages, and even the affair had nothing to do with Ree's death, but under relentless questioning, the cracks began to show. The weight of her lies became unbearable. She finally admitted to the affair, but swore that Pastor David Love had nothing to do with the murder then. In a twist no one saw coming, Teresa revealed she had become pregnant with David's child during their years-long affair. She told police she had wanted to end the relationship for some time, but fear kept her from breaking it off. She even admitted she allowed Pastor Love to deliver the eulogy at Ree's funeral because she was terrified of how he might react if she refused. "I told him to leave me alone," she said, "but he wouldn't. Stop texting me or calling me." Investigators had more urgent questions about a warning text David had sent Teresa on the morning of the murder, telling her not to go to the office alone, and yet, when she found Ree's body, her first call wasn't to 911, it was to her mother. Even more troubling, Teresa told her mother that Randy had been shot despite the fact that police had not released that detail. "How did you know Randy had been shot?" Detectives asked. Teresa hesitated before breaking down. She confessed that David had come to her the very night of the murder and told her exactly what he'd done, how he'd walked into Ree's office, aimed the gun, and fired to strengthen their case. Investigators had Teresa make a recorded phone call to David, hoping he would confess again on the call. She pleaded, "I want to know why. David, why?" He didn't admit anything over the phone, but it hardly mattered. The evidence was already stacking up. Surveillance footage showed a Ford Taurus in the area of the murder. Pastor Love had been driving his son's Taurus after losing his license in a DUI. His warning text, coupled with cell phone records placing him near the crime scene, became the final nails in the coffin. With a search warrant, police combed through David Love's home and his church, realizing the walls were closing. David fled Missouri and moved to South Carolina. He was arrested there after a Jackson County grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder and armed criminal action hours after being booked. David called his wife Kim from jail for years. She had suspected the affair between her husband and Teresa, but she asked him again and again, "Did you do it?" David, knowing the call was recorded, stayed silent. That silence spoke louder than words. What Kim didn't know was that she had been a target too, in the weeks after Ree's death. Teresa confided in a pastor in West Virginia, revealing that David had also planned to kill his own wife. The plan was chilling: break her neck, stage it as a car accident, roll her body down a hill, and collect on her life insurance with both of their spouses gone. David and Teresa planned to pay off his debts and start a new life together, but those plans crumbled in November 2011, facing overwhelming evidence. 51-year-old David Love accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, avoiding trial and sparing Ree's family the agony of reliving every detail in court for Ree's loved ones. The guilty plea brought a measure of closure, but the emotional wounds remained, one family member said. "He took accountability for what he did, and at least we didn't have to suffer through a long trial." The case wasn't over. In spring 2012, Teresa Stone, now facing charges as a co-conspirator, finally admitted her role in Ree's murder. For Ree's mother, Clara, the betrayal cut deep. "I would have rather she'd filed for divorce," she said quietly, "even though I don't believe in divorce. I'd rather she'd done that. If you're that unhappy, divorce them." She paused, then added bitterly, "He told me he loved me. I guess that was just another lie." Robert Davis, one of Randy's closest friends, said it best. He worshipped Teresa. She was everything to him. No matter where we were, whether at a work event or something social, he was always on the phone with her, or she'd be calling him. They were constantly in contact. In the end, Teresa pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, a Class B felony, carrying a possible sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison. For many of Randy's loved ones, that seemed far too lenient for the woman who had orchestrated the death of a good man. During her sentencing hearing, the full extent of her involvement came to light. Teresa admitted to telling David Love exactly where Randy's gun was kept and how to access it. Their text messages filled with chilling discussions about Randy's firearms, and suggestions of ending things with a single shot to the head, were damning despite the shocking revelations. Teresa's children, Michael and Miranda, stood by their mother in court tearfully. They begged the judge for mercy, telling the court how much they still needed her, especially after losing their father. Teresa herself pleaded, "I ask you, today, to show mercy in my case. I will do anything I have to do to pay back." Your Honor, the judge ultimately sentenced Teresa to 8 years in prison. David Love, once a respected pastor, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole in 2036. His wife, Kim, divorced him, later remarrying and saying she held no ill will toward either David or Teresa. She simply moved on after serving her sentence. Teresa was released and is reportedly living in the Kansas City area with a new partner, but for many, the idea of her walking free still feels deeply unjust. Serving time did not erase the fact that she plotted her own husband's murder and showed little remorse afterward. Some even suspected she had manipulated her children, making them believe losing her would be worse than losing their father. As for Pastor David Love, his betrayal was perhaps the most shocking of all. A spiritual leader, trusted by his congregation, who not only had an affair with Teresa, but conspired with her to kill a man who once considered him a friend. It's a sobering reminder that sometimes, the people we think we know best can harbor the darkest secret. Story 5. The last time I spoke to Sarah Jane on the phone was the last time I spoke to any of my children. Abusing your wife is already monstrous, but taking advantage of your stepdaughter is beyond evil. Over 2 decades ago, Lee Ford earned a place among Britain's most notorious stepfathers. After years of mistreating his family, he murdered his wife and her 4 children in one of the most harrowing crimes imaginable now, with the possibility of his release in the coming years. Outrage is growing. Many believe he should never see freedom again, and once you hear the full story, you'll understand why. Let's begin with Leslie, the central figure in this tragedy. On April 3, 1964, in the quiet riverside town of Fordingbridge, Hampshire, England, Leslie Wyatt gave birth to a baby girl. Leslie Margaret Wyatt. She grew up in Telford, Shropshire, surrounded by her loving brother and sister. Leslie was known for her warm smile, her kindness, and her willingness to help anyone in need. At 18, she met Michael Trenner, a man who had changed the course of her life. Michael first noticed her on a bus while she was working at a nursing home in Wellington. He was immediately drawn to her, describing her as amazing and feeling as if he'd hit the jackpot there. Connection was instant, so much so that Michael walked her home that very day. Their romance progressed quickly. They moved in together, got married, and began building a family. Michael was ecstatic at the thought of becoming a father, calling it a dream come true. Leslie, who loved children, was equally thrilled. Their first child, Sarah Jane, was born on January 10, 1983. Soon after, Leslie became pregnant again, giving birth to Anne-Marie. About a year and a half later, Stephen came next, followed by Craig. Jonathan. From the outside, it appeared to be a happy, loving family, but as so often happens, appearances would prove deceiving and things were about to take a dark turn. The strain of raising 4 children so quickly began to weigh heavily on Leslie's marriage. Just a year after their youngest, Craig, was born, Michael moved out, and the relationship ended in divorce. But Leslie didn't dwell on it for long. By early 1990, she had remarried. Her new husband, Lee Ford, was a laborer from Telford. Together, they had 2 more children, though the exact years of their births aren't widely documented from the start. Friends and family were wary of Lee. Something about him unsettled those who cared for Leslie on the surface. They seemed mismatched. Lee was slim, attractive, and approachable, while Lee had a rough, scruffy appearance and a tough demeanor. But it wasn't the physical differences that worried people. It was his attitude. Lee made no secret of his dislike for Leslie's ex-husband, Michael. He openly stated he didn't want Michael around, going out of his way to keep him from visiting the children. His controlling nature and intense jealousy were evident early on, both red flags for abusive Behavior abusers often want to erase any sign of a partner's previous relationships. And for Lee, Leslie's 4 children from her first marriage were a constant reminder of Michael. Michael had been a good father. But just a few months into their marriage, Lee's true nature emerged. He began hitting Leslie and acting aggressively toward her. She confided in friends and family about the abuse, making it clear she was living in fear. By 1995, she had reached her breaking point. Gathering her children, she fled to Cornwall, determined to start fresh, but Lee wasn't ready to let go. He tracked her down by posing as a solicitor and contacting her family, proof of how far he was willing to go to maintain control. Eventually, Leslie agreed to give him another chance. They moved to a small village in Cornwall, bringing all 6 of her children, 4 from her first marriage, and 2 with Lee. Ford's promises of change didn't last. His abuse escalated, and he grew even more controlling, dictating what Leslie could wear and involving himself in every aspect of her life. Escaping such a relationship isn't easy. Years of control can erode a person's self-worth, making it difficult to break free completely. A psychologist later suggested that Lee's abusive behavior was tied to Leslie's devotion to her children. He resented her for older kids, viewing them as living reminders of Michael. Feeling sidelined, Ford withdrew, spending more time at the pub and sinking into heavy drinking and drug use. He stopped participating in family life, often isolating himself in the garage to watch TV, rather than engaging with the children. Michael, meanwhile, was over 200 miles away in Telford, cut off from his children for 5 years. At Lee's insistence, the distance left him powerless and heartbroken. The situation deeply affected the children they lived with, the daily reality of abuse, and it showed. Sarah Jane, for example, was a quiet student with a troubling school. Record her poor attendance, hinting at deeper problems at home. Marie also struggled, keeping others at a distance. Leslie's brother, Peter, saw the impact firsthand when Lee wasn't around. The children were cheerful and energetic, laughing, playing, and acting like normal kids, but the moment he walked in, their demeanor shifted. They became quiet, withdrawn, and tense. One thing especially worried Peter: Lee's overprotectiveness of Sarah Jane. He kept her under close watch, to the point of even showing up. It all came to a head when Leslie finally summoned the courage to confront Ford once more about his twisted relationship with her daughters. For weeks, the suspicion had been gnawing at her, but now the truth was undeniable. She was worried, heartbroken, and furious, and she decided it was time to face him head-on. The confrontation was raw, emotional, and ugly. Words flew like daggers, and years of buried resentment erupted into the open. But instead of remorse, Ford's response was chilling. His anger boiled over, and in a terrifying escalation, the argument turned violent. In a matter of moments, rage consumed him, and what began as a verbal clash spiraled into a brutal, irreversible act of horror. One by one, Ford's fury turned lethal. Within just 24 hours, the lives of Leslie and her 4 children, Sarah Jane, 17, Marie, Ski, Stephen, 14, and Craig, 13, were extinguished. What should have been the start of a new chapter for Leslie became the final, devastating end. In the aftermath, Ford moved with an unnerving calm. He began weaving lies for friends, neighbors, and even family, claiming Leslie had left him, taking the children with her. He canceled a job interview, excusing it with a story about food poisoning. He sent his 2 biological children to stay with relatives, enrolled his youngest in a new school, and even tried to cash Sarah Jane's last paycheck in an almost surreal act of audacity. He made advances toward an old girlfriend, all while insisting to anyone who asked that Leslie had simply walked out. But Ford's charade began to crack when he phoned Peter, Leslie's brother. Peter, confused and uneasy, told him Leslie wasn't with him and demanded to know what was going on. Ford repeated his story about a fight over money, but Peter wasn't buying it. His gut told him something far darker was at play. Peter's instincts pushed him to contact the police, and from the very beginning, investigators sensed This wasn't just a missing persons case. Alarm bells were ringing. Even Leslie's ex-husband, Michael, voiced a chilling fear to his wife that Ford had killed the children. Faced with the growing investigation, Ford became desperate. He moved the decaying bodies of Sarah Jane and Marie from the woodshed to a potato field 4 miles away, wrapping them in polythene and wearing a face mask to mask the smell. He then took his own children to visit their grandparents, all while planning to dispose of the remaining bodies. On October 4th, police held a press conference announcing that Ford and his 2 children were now missing as well. That same day, officers intercepted him driving across Bodmin Moor. His children were found alive, but that night, the grim discovery began. Ford confessed over those harrowing 24 hours. He had murdered them all and buried the truth beneath a web of lies, deception, and calculated cruelty. On the day it all came to an end, Lee Ford's rage took on a cold, deliberate shape in the quiet of their bedroom. He reached for a baseball bat, its weight heavy in his hands, and brought it down on Leslie again and again. The blows were vicious, methodical, and unrelenting, until she could no longer fight back. But that wasn't enough. From there, he slipped into the garage and returned with a rope. He wrapped it around her neck with disturbing precision, strangling her in a way that left almost no visible marks. It was a calculated choice, designed not just to kill, but to erase the signs of violence. Then, with a kind of icy efficiency, Ford turned on the children. These were 4 kids he had helped raise for over a decade, children who had once trusted him, who saw him as family. One by one, he approached them from behind, looping that same rope around their small necks. The killings were silent, swift, and controlled. The pathologist would later describe his method as efficient for investigators. The word was haunting. Ford had planned this. He'd studied it. He'd researched how to commit murder without getting caught. And on that day, he put every lesson into practice. When it was over, he moved with the calm of someone finishing a task. He carried the bodies to a woodshed, then later to a potato field. There, he wrapped them in polythene sheet. Not burial. He spared only his own 2 biological children, with Leslie during his confession and trial. Ford showed no remorse. He first pleaded not guilty, trying to bluff his way through the mounting evidence. But on the morning his trial was set to begin, May 24, 2001, he abruptly changed course. He admitted to the murders of his wife and her 4 children. The court's sentence was swift: 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim. Initially, he faced a minimum of 35 years before parole. Later, that was reduced to 27 years, meaning the earliest he could walk free would be October 2027. Even then, release isn't guaranteed for the community. The wounds ran deep. Vigils, memorial gardens, books of condolence, they all stood as fragile attempts to make sense of a senseless slaughter. The funerals were heavy with grief, as neighbors and friends tried to process the void left behind. Leslie's former partner, Michael, and her brother Peter still carry the loss like a weight. And now, as 2027 approaches, a new fear has begun to creep in, the fear that Ford could someday walk among them again. A petition has circulated, urging the authorities to ensure he never leaves prison. For now, the parole board insists the case isn't even up for review, but the thought lingers, the memory lingers, and for those left behind, justice will never truly be served until Lee Ford dies behind bars. Robert William Fisher once dreamed of becoming a Navy SEAL, but he didn't make the cut. Still, he loved the outdoors, especially hunting and fishing. After a short stint as a firefighter in California, cut short by a back injury, he moved his family to Arizona. There, he found work in the medical field, taking jobs as a surgical catheter technician and respiratory therapist. In the late 1980s, he even spent time spraying weeds for the city. One former employer described him as quiet and dependable, but constantly battling back. Penn, 1987. Fisher married Mary Cooper. At first, they seemed like the picture of stability. They moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, bought a house on the 2200 block of 74th Place, and raised 2 children alongside a black Labrador retriever. The family was active in their Baptist church, presenting the image of a wholesome, tight-knit home but behind closed doors. The cracks began to show. Robert's friends knew he carried deep scars from his own parents' divorce, vowing he'd never let it happen to him. But his way of keeping the marriage intact was through control, sometimes cruel control. In one ugly incident, he turned a garden hose on Mary after she said something he didn't like. He seemed disappointed that his son Bobby didn't share his passion for hunting and fishing, and once taught Bobby and his sister Brittany to swim by tossing them off a boat into the water as they screamed in fear. Even the house itself reflected Robert's grip on the family. He refused to allow any wall color other than white, and decorations were limited to his approval. Quilts and tapestries gifted by Mary's family were banished to the closet, with Robert nagging her to throw them out at work. Fisher's colleagues at the Mayo Clinic noticed he often talked about his marital troubles, blaming his mother for leaving his father, even during hunting trips. Conversations often circled back to his problems at home. Friends also recalled disturbing behavior, smearing elk blood on his face for no reason, or firing his gun in the air near strangers at a campsite just to watch them panic. Neighbors noticed his cold demeanor toward his wife and children, especially when compared to the affection he lavished on his dog. In 1997, he had his first run-in with the law after shooting a neighbor's pit bull, claiming it was dangerous and had trespassed on his property. Police suspected he had intentionally lured the dog over. The marriage was unraveling. The couple sought counseling from their pastor, but nothing changed. Mary confided in friends that she planned to divorce Robert soon. The night of April 9, 2001, neighbors heard yet another heated argument inside the Fisher home around 10:30 p.m. Minutes later, the quiet suburban street was rocked by a deafening explosion. The blast blew out a brick wall of the house, flames shooting more than 20 feet into the air. The shockwave rattled homes blocks away, and 911 calls poured in. As firefighters raced to the scene, they found the Fisher home fully engulfed, the heat so intense it could be felt from the street. Fire crews worked desperately to keep the flames from spreading to the tightly packed neighboring homes. At that moment, they had no idea what they were dealing with, or whether anyone was trapped inside. Once the blaze was finally under control, investigators began combing through the charred remains. Almost immediately, something seemed off. One of the Fisher family's vehicles, Mary's white Toyota 4Runner, was missing for a brief moment. There was hope. Maybe the family had left before the explosion, completely unaware of the tragedy, but that hope faded quickly. The blast had been so powerful, it damaged Robert's truck, parked right out front. As the rubble cooled, the forensics team moved in, piecing together what had really happened. It didn't take long for them to make a chilling discovery: the remains of 3 bodas. At first, it was assumed they'd died in the fire, but the medical examiner's findings told a far darker story. Robert's wife, Mary Cooper Fisher, and the couple's 2 children, 12-year-old Brittany and 10-year-old Bobby, had all been murdered before the flames ever started. In the wreckage, investigators found evidence that the fire had been deliberately set to cover the crime. A hose had been pulled from the home's furnace, and a candle had been placed on the floor next to accelerants, like gasoline. An intentional setup meant to trigger an explosion. One item that survived the inferno was Robert Fisher's gun safe, still containing several weapons, some movies, and personal items, but one thing was missing: his .357 handgun. That same night, at 10:40 p.m., Robert was caught on surveillance withdrawing the daily maximum $280 from an ATM. He was wearing an Oakland Raiders cap, and in the background, Mary's 4Runner was clearly visible. At first, investigators hesitated to call him a suspect, but as pieces of the puzzle came together, the picture became clear. If Robert were innocent, why hadn't he returned home? Why take all his clothes? Why empty his bank account and vanish? The coincidences were simply too much to ignore. Robert William Fisher was formally charged with 3 counts of felony murder, 1 count of felony arson, and unlawful flight. To avoid prosecution, his image was plastered across wanted posters nationwide. A white male, 6 feet tall, about 180 pounds, with a surgical scar on his lower back and a gold upper bicuspid tooth, though investigators believe he may have had it removed when Mary's forerunner was found deep in Arizona's Tonto National Forest. Foul weather forced police to suspend the search. Only a mile around the vehicle's location was covered before snow set in. Footprints led toward the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, but that area was never fully searched. Many believe Fisher made it to the reservation and either received help or hitched a ride out of the area. A local couple later reported seeing a man matching his description walking along Young Road days before the vehicle was discovered. An acquaintance, Lori Greenbeck, recalled her husband camping with Fisher in the same area just weeks earlier, leading her to believe he'd been scouting a potential hideout, despite hopes that finding the car would lead to a quick arrest. The trail went cold in June 2002. Robert William Fisher was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list as the 475th person to ever be placed on it. Publicity from America's Most Wanted and The Hunt with John Walsh brought hundreds of tips, but every reported sighting has been either inconclusive or proven false. A skilled outdoorsman and survivalist, Robert Fisher may still be out there, living off the grid, or he may have vanished in a way only he could have planned. Surviving alone in the wilderness for decades is, in the words of professional survival instructor Cody London, a death card when asked if it was possible for Robert William Fisher to live off the land for 20 years. London's answer was blunt: hell no. For investigators, there's been no credible sign of anyone living in those woods still. Over the years, strange sightings have fueled speculation that Fisher may still be out there. One such incident occurred in 2009 in Guatemala. Two tourists were taking photographs when a visibly agitated Caucasian man approached them. He demanded that they delete any pictures where he might have appeared in the background. His behavior was so aggressive and erratic that the local police became involved. Witnesses later noted that his demeanor closely matched Fisher's known tendencies. An earlier and more publicized encounter happened in 2004 in White Rock, a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Fisher, right down to a missing tooth in the exact spot where Fisher had a gold bicuspid and a surgical scar identical to one Fisher carried. His age, height, and weight matched almost perfectly. The RCMP contacted U.S. authorities, who ran a fingerprint analysis. The results were clear. This was not Robert William Fisher yet. Even after the test, some of Fisher's former neighbors swore the man was him. It took the man's own mother, armed with a birth certificate, family photographs, and other personal records, to finally clear his name. Still, some newspapers prematurely reported Fisher's capture in Canada, causing unnecessary chaos and stress over time. More mistaken identities followed before Utah's infamous cabin burglar, Troy James Knapp, was identified and captured. Many believed he might be Fisher. Knapp's off-grid lifestyle and survival skills seemed to fit the profile, but that theory collapsed when Knapp was confirmed to be someone else entirely. In 2012, the FBI tipped off local authorities that Fisher might be living near the spot where his wife's car was found 2 years later. In October 2014, police raided a home in Commerce City, Colorado. Based on another promising lead, the operation yielded to unrelated arrests, but no Fisher to this day. No confirmed sightings have surfaced. Theories about his fate range from the grim to the elaborate. Some believe Fisher may have taken his own life in Tonto National Forest, disappearing into one of the many caves, but profilers doubted his arrogance, self-preservation, and unwillingness to admit defeat make suicide seem unlikely. In April 2016, on the 15th anniversary of the murders, the FBI and Scottsdale police held a press conference. They unveiled age-progressed images of Fisher in hopes of rekindling public interest, but on November 3, 2021, after nearly 2 decades with no concrete leads, Fisher was removed from the FBI's 10 most wanted list. His place was given to Julian Adoni, Arquez, alleged leader of MS-13 in Honduras 7. So, Fisher remains a wanted fugitive. Some investigators believe he may have quietly started a new life under an assumed identity, possibly even a new family. Others think he could be hiding in plain sight, working cash jobs as a handyman in a small town or blending into the anonymity of a big city. Another theory suggests he might have crossed into Mexico before 9/11, when border security was more relaxed. If so, he could have vanished into another country entirely. Police warn that if Fisher did start a new family, there's always the risk that one day, just like before, he might decide to walk away, leaving behind another trail of heartbreak, an unanswered question, source of warmth and laughter. The kind of person who could light up a room without even trying. But behind her bright smile, Heather had recently been through emotional turbulence, tied to a complicated and ultimately toxic relationship. Just a year earlier, Heather had met Sidney Moore, a much older man. While working at the Tilted Kilt, their friendship quickly developed into a romantic affair, one that was intense, secretive, and fraught with consequences. Sidney was married, and his wife, Tammy Mora soon discovered the betrayal. What followed was a spiral of jealousy, threats, and intimidation that Heather's family would later describe as relentless. In the weeks before she vanished, Heather had been trying to move on. She found new romantic interests, reconnected with friends, and began to talk about her future again. But according to Brianna, Sidney still lingered on the edges of her life, calling from blocked numbers, sending messages through mutual acquaintances, and finding ways to pull her back into conversation. The call Heather received from Sidney on the night of December 18th seemed to be one of those attempts. Hours later, her car would be found abandoned at Peachtree Landing, a place where Heather had no reason to be, especially in the middle of the night. For Terry Elvis, the sight of that car sitting alone by the riverbank would mark the beginning of an unending nightmare. His gut told him something was terribly wrong, even as investigators assured him there was no sign of foul play, at least not yet. What no one knew at that moment was that this quiet, isolated dock would become the centerpiece of a mystery that would grip the entire community and lead to accusations of betrayal, obsession, and murdering. The days following Heather's disappearance, police focused on retracing her final known movements. Surveillance footage from a gas station near her apartment captured Heather. Just hours before she vanished, she appeared calm, pumping gas into her green Dodge Intrepid. Wearing a dark top and jeans, investigators noted that nothing in her demeanor suggested distress or fear, at least not on the surface. Phone records soon became a critical piece of the puzzle. They showed a series of calls and texts between Heather and Sidney Moore in the late hours of December 18th and early morning of December 19th. One call in particular stood out: a short conversation between the two just before 2 a.m., followed by Heather's phone pinging near the Mora property. Roughly an hour later, her phone signal moved toward Peachtree Landing, and then nothing. The signal went dark. Investigators interviewed Sidney and his wife Tammy almost immediately. Both claimed they had nothing to do with Heather's disappearance. Tammy's account, however, raised eyebrows. She admitted confronting Heather in the past, accusing her of ruining her marriage, and even sending her threatening messages. In one exchange recovered from social media, Tammy had written, "You can have him. The only thing he's good for is a quick F. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." The tone was bitter, possessive, and laced with hostility. As detectives dug deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. Friends of Heather reported that in the months before she vanished, she confided about being harassed by the Moorers. She feared Tammy, in particular, describing her as controlling and capable of anything. One friend recalled Heather saying, "If anything ever happens to me, look at them first." Meanwhile, search teams scoured the dense woods and marshlands along the Wakama River. Boats dragged the murky water near Peachtree Landing, while volunteers combed the shoreline for any sign of Heather. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Despite the massive effort, there was no trace, no clothing, no personal belongings, no remains. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night. Still, investigators were convinced this was no random disappearance. The combination of her sudden communication with Sydney, the location of her abandoned car, and the strained relationship with Tammy painted a picture of premeditation. They believed Heather had been lured to Peachtree, landing under false pretenses, possibly by a promise from Sydney to talk or reconciling that whatever happened to her occurred there, far from witnesses. In the quiet darkness of the riverbank, Heather was known for her radiant personality, warm, sociable, and fiercely devoted to living life on her own terms. Friends described her as a free spirit who embraced every opportunity for adventure. By 2013, she had settled into a comfortable routine, sharing an apartment in Myrtle Beach with her best friend, Brianna, and doing well in school life, it seemed, was unfolding beautifully. But everything changed after a seemingly ordinary shift at the Tilted Kilt on a warm June afternoon. Heather was busy taking orders, chatting with regulars, and ferrying trays to the kitchen when she crossed paths with 37-year-old Sidney Moore. He was a father of 3, a handyman who owned a small kitchen appliance repair business. And that day, he'd come in on a work order from the restaurant. They struck up an easy conversation, and Heather felt an undeniable pull toward him soon. Sydney began showing up more often. They discovered shared interests, swapped stories, and before long, Heather was dropping hints on Twitter about her attraction to older men. By late July, she was posting messages clearly meant for Sydney, speaking openly about him to friends and co-workers. What started as harmless flirting quickly deepened into something more intimate. Sydney would linger at the restaurant, bringing Heather coffee and snacks, waiting by the back door after her shifts so they could leave together. They talked constantly on the phone, in person, and during drives to secluded spots where they could be alone. Sydney told her he was unhappy in his marriage and wanted to leave his wife, Tammy, but Heather's friends warned her these were empty promises, and Sydney was only using Irby. Mid-September, Heather seemed to realize she had been drawn into something toxic. On September 21st, she tweeted cryptically, "Once an angel and a demon fell in love." But it didn't lead to a good outcome. That reckoning came to a head when Tammy discovered the affair, according to Brianna. Tammy called Heather directly, unleashing a torrent of insults at one point. She even had Sydney get on the line to tell Heather she meant nothing to him, that she was just an easy target. The words cut deep, leaving Heather humiliated and heartbroken. Prosecutors would later describe Tammy as the controlling force in the Moorer household, dictating Sydney's schedule, his movements, even handcuffing him to the bed at night so he couldn't leave. While she slept, she changed his phone password, forced him to tattoo her name across his stomach, and made it clear that betrayal would not go unpunished. The harassment didn't end with phone calls. Tammy began targeting Heather's job, calling the restaurant repeatedly to demand she be fired. She used Sydney's phone to send Heather explicit photos and videos of the couple, including intimate moments, taunting her with them. Heather even wrote Sydney a letter, pleading with him to make Tammy stop trying to reclaim some normalcy. Heather started going to church with Brianna, but the messages from Tammy kept coming, escalating in both tone and frequency. By early November, the threats had grown darker, more personal, and far more menacing. In early November, the harassment escalated again. Tammy began sending Heather fresh messages, cutting, venomous words designed to humiliate her and keep the wound open. Some of these messages included taunts about Sydney's supposed feelings for her, while others were cruel reminders of the intimate moments Heather once thought were real. Heather confided to Brianna that she felt trapped between wanting to move forward with her life and the constant pull of this toxic situation. She was beginning to see Sydney not as the charming man she first met, but as someone who had manipulated her emotions and abandoned her when it suited him for a brief moment. It seemed like she might break free completely. Heather focused on her classes, spent more time with friends, and even started seeing someone new. Her social media posts hinted at renewed confidence, a desire to laugh again, to reclaim her independence. But the Moores weren't finished with her. Tammy's grip on the situation remained iron-tight. Witnesses later testified that Tammy would still check Sydney's phone constantly, track his whereabouts, and keep the affair alive in her mind, like an unresolved insult. It wasn't enough for her to win her husband back. Tammy wanted Heather humiliated, silenced, and erased from their lives entirely. By the time December rolled around, Heather was on edge. Friends noticed she seemed more cautious, locking her phone quickly if it buzzed, glancing over her shoulder in public. And then came the night of December 18th, a night when Sydney suddenly reappeared in her life after weeks of distance, setting into motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. On the evening of December 18, 2013, Heather clocked out of her shift at the Tilted Kilt and drove back to the apartment she shared with Brianna. It had been a fairly normal day until a call came in that would change everything. At 9:38 p.m., Sydney Moore contacted her out of the blue after weeks of silence and humiliation. He suddenly claimed he wanted to meet and talk. He told her he was finally free from Tammy's watchful eye and wanted to rekindle what they had. Cell phone records later revealed that this was not a random act. Sydney had borrowed a friend's phone to make the call, likely to keep Tammy from knowing. Investigators would later describe this moment as the bait in a carefully set trap. Heather seemed hesitant. At first, friends who later heard the call said she was quiet, almost guarded, but Sydney pressed on, playing on her emotions and reminding her of the connection they once shared. Within minutes, the walls she'd built began to crumble. Shortly before midnight, Heather drove to meet another friend for a quick coffee, her mood notably lighter. She even told this friend about Sydney's call, confessing that, despite everything, she still cared for him. The friend warned her to stay away, but Heather brushed it off, insisting it was just a talk. At 1:35 a.m., phone records showed another brief conversation between Heather and Sydney. This time, Sydney told her to meet him at a secluded location. The details of that conversation would become chilling in hindsight. By 3 a.m., Heather's phone pinged near a remote boat landing along the Wakama River. Surveillance cameras in the area later showed her car heading in that direction. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive when Heather didn't return home that morning. Brianna initially thought she'd stayed over at a friend's, but by mid-afternoon, the unease began to set in. Heather's phone went straight to voicemail, and her social media, which she checked constantly, was silent. By the evening of December 19, her family reported her missing. Investigators immediately began retracing her last movements, and the trail led them straight to Sydney and Tammy Moore. Tammy insisted she had nothing to do with Heather's disappearance. She painted herself as a wronged wife who had fought to save her marriage, claiming she had moved on from the affair. But investigators were unconvinced. The timeline they were building suggested otherwise, and her social media activity, full of sharp, taunting remarks about Heather, told a different story. According to Tammy, she and Sydney had been trying to repair their relationship since early 2012, and she insisted that Heather was no longer part of their lives. Yet the messages, the phone calls, and the witnesses who had seen the obsessive behavior all contradicted her account. By late December, the investigation was shifting from general search efforts to a precise reconstruction of Heather's final hours. Detectives had enough to suspect that the payphone call, the sudden re-emergence of Sydney in Heather's life, and the couple's erratic behavior were all connected. What they needed now was a clear link, a piece of evidence that would place Sydney and Tammy directly in the path Heather took that night. That link would come soon, and when it did, it would unravel the last hours of a young woman who thought she was starting a new chapter in life, only to be pulled back into the dangerous orbit of the Moors. December 18, 2013, early morning hours. At 1:35 a.m., Heather made her first attempt to call back the number that had just contacted her. This wasn't an ordinary call. It came from a payphone, something few people used in 2013. She didn't stop after one try. Within the next 15 minutes, she called that same number 9 times, a clear sign she desperately wanted to speak with the caller. Phone records showed the call originated from a payphone outside a Kangaroo Express gas station on 17th Avenue in Myrtle Beach. when detectives pulled surveillance footage from the store. They saw a man entering the phone booth moments before the call to Heather was placed. His build, posture, and clothing matched Sidney more initially. Sidney denied making the call, but when confronted with the footage, he changed his story, admitting he had phoned Heather, but claiming he only wanted to tell her to stop contacting him. Investigators didn't buy it. Heather had not reached out to Sidney for weeks, and the flurry of calls afterward suggested he had drawn her back in that night, 1:44 a.m. to 2 a.m. Records showed Heather placed another short call to the payphone number minutes later. She called Brianna, her close friend and co-worker, telling her she had received a strange call from Sidney. Brianna would later tell police that Heather sounded both nervous and curious. She was wondering why Sidney was reaching out after so long, and in the middle of the night, 2:29 a.m., Heather's phone pinged at her apartment complex, indicating she had returned home. A neighbor later recalled seeing her car, a dark green Dodge Intrepid, in the lot around this time, 3:16 a.m. Surveillance cameras at the apartment complex captured Heather leaving again. She was alone, wearing casual clothes, and appeared calm. Detectives believed she may have been heading to meet Sidney, likely under the impression that he wanted to talk privately. 3:38 a.m. Heather's phone connected to a cell tower near Peachtree Landing, a secluded boat landing in Socastee. This was a remote, poorly lit area along the Waccama River far from the busy tourist sections of Myrtle Beach. After that, there were no more calls, no more texts, and no more pings. From Heather's phone it went silent. Forever. Tommy had long argued that Heather wasn't just the other woman, but that she had led what Tammy described as an inappropriate lifestyle. She called Heather's behavior abnormal, insisting the real problem went beyond infidelity. Detectives, however, were less interested in Tammy's moral judgments and more focused on tangible leads, acting on their suspicions. They began reviewing every security camera in the surrounding neighborhoods. It wasn't long before they struck gold. Shortly before Heather received that late-night call, Sidney Moore was caught on surveillance footage inside a local supermarket buying a pregnancy test. When questioned, Sidney told the cashier it was for his wife, but investigators couldn't help but wonder if it was truly meant for Tammy or for Heather. More incriminating evidence emerged from cameras mounted along a quiet, isolated stretch of road leading to Peachtree Landing, the place where Heather's car was later found at 3:36 a.m. A Ford F-150, nearly identical to Sidney's truck, was filmed heading toward the landing just 10 minutes later. The same vehicle was captured, leaving the area. Experts later confirmed that the truck was indeed Sidney's. By this point, investigators believed Sidney had been the last person Heather spoke to, and the last person to see her alive. Using Heather's phone records, police reconstructed the final movements of that night with chilling precision. 2:30 a.m. Heather's phone attempts to call the payphone number Sidney had been using. There's no answer. She drives to Longbeard's Bar and Grill in Carolina Forest, a short distance from her apartment, and stays for about 15 minutes. Heather then heads toward Augusta Plantation Drive before returning to Longbeard's for another 15 minutes. She tries Sidney again, no answer, before returning to her apartment for about 5 minutes. 3:25 a.m. Sidney's phone receives another call from Heather. This time, he answers, and the two speak for 4 minutes. 3:37 a.m. Heather's phone pings at Peachtree Landing. She calls Sidney 3 more times, each going unanswered. 3:41 a.m. Her final call attempt to Sidney. 3:42 a.m. Heather's phone goes dark, permanently disconnected from the network. The security footage of Sidney's truck was damning enough, but what police discovered next only deepened their suspicions. After obtaining a search warrant, investigators combed through the Moores' property. They learned that, on December 20th, Sidney and Tammy had suspiciously removed their home video surveillance system the very next day. They installed a new one while the old footage was gone. Recordings from the new system told their own story. Sidney and Tammy methodically wiping down the interior of their truck and then burning the rags they'd used on the same day. The new cameras went up 2 months later, On February 21, 2014, authorities announced a major development. Sydney and Tammy Moore were arrested on charges of kidnapping. Heather Elvis murder charges would later be added. Despite Heather's body never being found, the couple remained silent in jail, refusing to give any testimony without Heather's remains. Prosecutors knew their murder case was on shaky ground eventually. Those charges were dropped, but the kidnapping charge held firm. Heather's mother, Debbie, was heartbroken that the murder charges didn't stick, but relieved she wouldn't have to sit through a trial filled with potentially graphic details about her daughter's fate. The family hoped that, with less pressure, more witnesses might come forwards. Sydney's legal troubles didn't end there. In 2017, he was convicted of obstructing justice and sentenced to 10 years in prison then. In 2019, 6 long years after Heather vanished, the Moores finally stood trial for her kidnapping. The proceedings drew massive public interest. Witness after witness testified. Evidence was meticulously laid out, and the couple's involvement in Heather's disappearance was painted in painstaking detail. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty. Both Sydney and Tammy Moore were sentenced to 30 years in prison for kidnapping and conspiracy, to be served concurrently before leaving the courtroom. Sydney made a final statement. Despite his conviction, he continued to proclaim his innocence, addressing Heather's parents directly. He described their daughter as a wonderful girl, and said he regretted the tragedy that had befallen her. As a father himself, he claimed to understand their pain, acknowledging he couldn't undo what had happened, but offering no answers for Heather's family. The verdict brought justice, but not closure. They still believed the full truth had yet to be told. They described Heather as a bright, sincere young woman who had been deceived and destroyed by 2 manipulative and cruel people on her birthday. Family and friends gathered at the public park near Peachtree Landing, the place her car was found. They brought flowers, lit candles, and collected donations in Heather's memory, a tribute to a life stolen far too soon memorial site, creating a quiet yet powerful tribute to the young woman whose life had been stolen too soon. Purple balloons, the color Heather loved, drifted into the sky as friends and family shared stories of her infectious laugh, her love for photography, and her big dreams for the future. Debbie Elvis, holding back tears, told those gathered that while justice had been served in court, true closure could only come when Heather was found and brought home. "We will never stop looking," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her words, "and we will never stop telling her story each year since Heather's disappearance." Community has returned to Peachtree Landing to honor her memory. Candlelight vigils are held. Photos of Heather are displayed, and the haunting absence of her presence is felt deeply by all who knew her. The case of Heather Elvis remains a reminder that even with convictions, some wounds never heal, and that the unanswered questions can weigh as heavily as the verdicts for her family. The search continues for the public. Her name has become a symbol of resilience, justice, and the unyielding hope that one day, the full truth will finally come to light. In the years following the convictions, rumors and speculation about what truly happened to Heather persisted. Some locals whispered about sightings, though none were ever confirmed. Others believed that someone else, perhaps even beyond Sydney and Tammy, might know where Heather's remains were hidden. Law enforcement continued to receive tips, some credible, others nothing more than cruel hoaxes, but no breakthrough ever came. Investigators have said that the location of Heather's body is the key to understanding her final moments. Without it, there will always be gaps in the timeline and unanswered questions about the exact circumstances of her death. That missing piece has kept the case in the public eye and in the hearts of those determined to bring her home. Meanwhile, Sydney and Tammy Moore remain behind bars, both steadfast in their claims of innocence, despite the evidence presented against them. From time to time, their names surface in prison correspondence or interviews, reigniting debate over their guilt and the lingering mystery for Heather's parents. Every passing year is marked by milestones. She will never reach birthdays, holidays, the anniversaries of the day she disappeared. They channel their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the importance of community vigilance, the dangers of toxic relationships, and the power of persistence when searching for the missing Peachtree Landing. Once just a quiet, scenic spot along the Wakama River, has now become an enduring symbol of loss. The weathered dock and still waters bear silent witness to the last place Heather was known to be alive. Visitors still leave flowers there, sometimes with notes that simply say, "We remember the memorial." Site became more than just a place to grieve, it grew into a beacon for advocacy. The funds raised there were channeled into a center for missing persons, a living tribute to Heather's memory, and a way to aid other families enduring the same nightmare. For the Elvis family, this wasn't just charity. It was part of their mission to keep their daughter's name alive and push forward in the search for answers. Yet, despite the vigils, the donations, and the relentless awareness campaigns, Heather's body has never been found. Every year, on her birthday, the family posts fresh missing person announcements, an unbroken chain of hope and heartbreak. Each post is both a call to action and a reminder to the world that Heather's story remains unfinished. Her mother, Debbie, has often spoken about the impossibility of closure without the truth. She likens the search for answers to carrying a weight you can't set down, a constant, exhausting burden. Still, she believes that persistence, no matter how many years pass, could one day lead someone to come forward with the missing piece. And so, as the rain falls softly on vigils and memorial nights, the story of Heather Elvis remains part of the community's fabric. It's a reminder, whispered through the rustling leaves and dark waters of Peachtree Landing, that mysteries are not just puzzles, they are lives interrupted. Here at Crime Whispers, we hold on to those stories not only to remember, but to keep watch.